Hi there guys, and welcome to another A-level biology revision session with Mr Phillips, and today we're continuing after the Hardy-Weinberg video to look at variation and selection genetics. A lot of this stuff I think sort of comes up in the first year content as well, so it might feel like revision, but it's important to just make sure you're adding any extra details. Let's make a start then. So just remind you about the Hardy-Weinberg theories, the idea that allele frequency will stay constant over generations, and you can use it to calculate the number of heterozygous individuals in a population or the different number of alleles. But you have to ensure for this to be able to work over generations, the population is large enough to eliminate sampling errors, mating is random, there's no natural selection occurring, and there's no immigration or emigration or gene mutation. So there are quite a lot of problems with this in the fact that that is unlikely to be true, because at least there's going to be immigration and emigration, but also you could have change in population size and obviously natural selection. And this is because different organisms will have different reproductive success. If you think about it, natural selection is constantly pushing because all organisms reproduce, and if they all survived, then the population would increase. But obviously we have this natural carrying capacity, which we've talked about recently. And therefore, there's the reason that not all organisms survive is this constant selection pressure, which is a type of environmental resistance. And this resistance will therefore affect the population and drive nature. So what actually determines who survives? Well, it's all due to variation. And you should know obviously from GCSE and previous learning that the best adapted will survive and outcompete the others, survival of the fittest. And there's a higher chance of survival to reproduce, therefore you pass on those advantageous alleles. So just to introduce it, what is variation? Because we haven't actually said, well, variation is simply the difference between individuals, and there's different types. There's obviously interspecific, which is inter, ER, which is between individuals of a different species. So that one is your different species. And then intraspecific, which is individuals from the same species. And all variation can be caused by either genetic or environmental factors. And it could be that you have individuals in the same species, they all have, you need to know whether they all have the same genes, but mutations and changes in meiosis, such as crossing over and independent assortment, allow different alleles to be created and passed on. Obviously, we said also variation can just be environmental factors. So you could be a twin, but if one of you has a healthy lifestyle and one of you doesn't, then the environment is affecting you. Now, evolution, therefore, is the change of a gene allele frequency. And that change in allele frequency occurs over time. And there's two reasons that variation happens. What we're going to look at today is natural selection, and there's also genetic drift. So if we have a look at this, we've got then how natural selection works. This should be a recap from year 12 and GCSE for you, but effectively within a population there is always variation in phenotypes, and this phenotype, as we said, generally comes from mutations. Okay, the ones that have the more advantageous allele have a higher reproductive success, and therefore this phenotype, as a result of that allele, allows those organisms to survive longer and reproduce more. Those ones then pass on the advantageous allele to the next generation, and over generations the allele becomes more common, i.e. it has a higher frequency over time. And that's why the Hardy-Weinberg theory only works if natural selection isn't happening. Let's look at it in terms of selection pressures. And then look at how evolution occurs. So first of all, you need to understand the term selection pressure. This is just an environmental factor that increases the chance of survival. So if you look at these leaves and these insects here, this insect has the greater chance of survival because the selection pressure is the colour of the leaf, and it either offers camouflage or it doesn't offer camouflage. So just to remind you about natural selection, this is a previous video from the year 1 content. Look up natural selection on there. But natural selection, if you ever ask a question about it, you always answer it in the same way. So natural selection is how evolution happens. Individuals in a species always show a wide range of phenotypic variation, and that is caused by a mutation. and that gives rise to new alleles. Those ones that therefore have that mutation are more likely to have that allele, are more likely to survive, and therefore they're more likely to breed and be more successful. The genes then enabling this survival then pass on then to the next generation, so that allele gets passed on to the next generation. And just to sort of remind you, we've got this selection pressure. Well, the selection pressure for the drafts would be the fact that there is an environmental change and maybe the leaves are only at the top of the trees, not at the bottom of the trees on a year of drought. So there are different types of selection then, and these are ones that you need to be familiar with the graphs for, and you need to be able to explain them. So the first type of selection is stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection is when in the middle range of characteristics are the more suited. So let's say this was height, for example, or birth mass in humans is the best example. Obviously a low birth mass, which would be down here, is going to be very unadvantageous. The less babies are going to survive. And at really high levels, it means there's going to be more likely to be issues during childbirth, so they're less likely to survive. So therefore what you get is an erosion of the external ranges effectively, and that means that the middle range is best adapted, and it's a stable population, a stable environment, because nothing's going to change that. There's always going to be a suitable birth mass depending on survival rates once they're born and complications during birth. And this therefore over time reduces that phenotypic variation, which means that over time the birth mass in humans becomes more and more narrow until you have this very narrow range, which means the mode stays the same. Next example is directional selection, and this is generally caused when a selection pressure, which remember is the environment selecting which conditions are best, which conditions are present. When there's an environmental change which changes that selection pressure, that will then cause a shift in which alleles are more advantageous and which alleles are therefore found and which has that frequency. So let's say our leaves change colour, and let's say the leaves went from being that green colour, which we've talked about before, to this sort of browny colour here, and they stayed at that browny colour. This would shift which alleles have more the advantage, and it would go from the allele which causes the green phenotype to now the allele which causes the brown phenotype, and therefore you get a change in the allele frequency in one direction. And this has been basically a single extreme phenotype will allow survival, so therefore you get this single allele which allows survival, and it's normally caused by environmental change. An example where we think this might have happened is in cheetahs, which in the past they might have had slower ones and faster ones, but over time when the environment became more harsher, maybe the cheetahs which were faster were able to catch the prey, the ones that didn't, and therefore the ones that had that faster allele meant they could survive, and over time this has shifted the phenotype one way, and therefore the cheetahs have now become faster, and then since then that has become a constant factor. And then the last one is a bit of a stranger one. It is allele frequencies being altered into disruptive selection. And this is the idea that maybe originally you might have had this sort of normal curve, but different organisms have adapted within the species to cope with different things. So it might be that they've adapted to cope with different extreme phenotypes, and therefore the environment might favour more than one phenotype. So a good example is beak size in birds. And you can see this when you look at the Galapagos Islands and Charles Darwin and how all the different species of finches developed. But maybe in one group of birds started feeding on insects in the fruit, whereas the other group of birds might have started feeding on the seeds of the fruit, and therefore they've adapted different beaks over time to cope with that, and their alleles have altered due to that. So this normally is when the environment favours more than one phenotype, and the alleles or extreme phenotypes are more likely to survive. So what you get is this dip in the middle, and you might eventually get this point where you end up with two different species, because this becomes more of a separating mechanism than originally thought. So I hope that's useful for you guys. I'm going to see you again soon where we look at natural selection, genetic drift and isolating mechanisms.